The physician's hands are cold. That is the first thing Petronia notices. Not the witnesses standing by the door, not her master watching from the far wall, not the smell of olive oil and burning herbs that fill the small examination chamber like a slow tide. The hands, cold against the curve of her belly, where 7 months of life have been growing, pressing, moving in the small hours of the night when she lies alone and thinks about things she has no permission to think about. She is 22 years old. She has learned to keep her face empty when men touch her. She has learned to retreat to a place inside her mind where hands cannot reach, where she exists without permission or apology, where she is something other than what the law says she is. She has been practicing this retreat since she was old enough to understand why certain doors in the household stayed locked and certain women came back from behind them with their eyes changed. But this examination is different. This examination has witnesses, 3 slaves standing silent at the door, the household steward with his wax tablet, the physician with his cold hands and his professional neutrality, and Gaius Corvilius Vatia, her master, 43 years old, a man of medium height and unremarkable features, standing against the far wall with his arms crossed, watching the proceedings with the expression he wears when inspecting livestock at market. He has not looked at her face. He has not looked at her face since the night 7 months ago, when he visited the women's quarters and the life now pressing against the physician's hands was made. He looks at her belly. He looks at it the way he looks at any investment he is trying to calculate. The air in this small chamber smells of olive oil and smoldering myrrh from a bronze dish on the shelf. Morning light cuts through a single high window, laying a rectangle of gold across the stone floor between Petronia and the door. Outside the wall, she can hear birds singing in the garden, their sound obscenely cheerful against the weight that fills this room like smoke filling a sealed space. 7 months, the physician announces. The child is positioned correctly. Based on the size, I estimate a healthy birth weight. The mother is strong. She should survive delivery without complications. Should survive. The words stay in the air. Vacha uncrosses his arms. The question he says, speaking for the first time since the examination began, is whether the investment justifies the cost. The physician nods as if this is a reasonable framework for discussing a human life. Because in Rome, in the year this story takes place, it is the only framework that has ever been applied to a situation like this. The mother's labor value during pregnancy and nursing represents approximately 18 months of reduced productivity. Against this must be weighed the value of a verna at current market rates. Homeborn slaves command premiums of 30 to 40% over foreign captured stock. I know the calculations, Vatia interrupts. I have made them many times. What I need to know is whether this particular pregnancy will produce a particular kind of child. Something shifts in the room. Petronia feels it before she understands it. The physician's hands pause their examination. The attendants at the door seem to stop breathing. I need to know, Vatia says, whether she carries a boy or a girl. Throw out everything you think you know about Roman slavery. The gladiators, the mines, the crosses along the Appian Way after Spartacus was finished. That version of Roman slavery is real, but it is the version Rome was willing to depict, the version that confirmed Roman power. Roman order, Roman willingness to enforce discipline at scale. What Rome was not willing to depict, what the legal text recorded in careful neutral language, while the historians looked away, was something more systematic and more intimate, and in certain respects far more efficient than anything that happened in an arena. Roman slavery at its height was not primarily a system of violence. It was a system of reproduction, an apparatus for turning human beings into property by ensuring that human beings were born as property, raised as property, conditioned from their first breath to understand themselves as property, and then managed according to the same logic applied to livestock or agricultural equipment or any other asset that generates returns over time. The apparatus had a name in Roman law: partus ventrum sequitur. The offspring follows the womb. 4 words that determined the fate of every child born to an enslaved woman in the Roman world. 4 words that the most celebrated legal minds in Western history refined and clarified and applied with the same precision they brought to contracts in property transfers and inheritance disputes. 4 words that built an empire's labor force generation by generation without requiring the cost and risk and political difficulty of continuous warfare. This is not a story about Roman violence. This is the story of Roman rationality applied without limit, and it is far more disturbing than anything that happened in the arena. What you are about to follow is the mechanism of that rationality layer by layer, from the law that created the conditions through the economics that made it profitable through the operational infrastructure that processed children into products, all the way to the woman who spent the better part of 2 decades learning this enterprise well enough to run it in reverse. We are going to follow Petronia from that examination room through every calculation Vatia made about the child she carried, through every decision the system made for both of them, until the moment the apparatus produced something it was never designed to produce. Before we go any further, drop a comment telling me what city and country you are watching from right now. And if you have not subscribed yet, hit subscribe. You are watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. The legal architecture that made everything Vatia did not only permissible but rational, and celebrated and studied by his neighbors as good practice. That architecture was not built in a single generation. It accumulated over centuries, refined by men who understood themselves to be doing the work of civilization. Picture the rooms where that work happened, not courtrooms, studies. The smell of tallow candles burning low ink, drying on stretched hide, the scratch of a stylus working through edge cases in exceptional scenarios. The atmosphere of precision applied to categories. Roman jurists were among the most analytically gifted legal minds the ancient world produced. Their work on contracts, property rights, inheritance, and obligation formed the skeleton of legal systems that European nations would still be using 15 centuries after Rome collapsed. The precision was real. The achievement was genuine. It was also applied without hesitation to the question of how to own human beings in a way that would remain legally unambiguous across generations. Partus ventrum sequitur solved what Roman lawmakers saw as a practical problem. When a free man fathered a child with an enslaved woman, which happened constantly in every household, across every class of Roman society, what was the status of that child? Tying status to the father would have been administratively chaotic and economically catastrophic. Any enslaved woman impregnated by her master would produce a free child. The master would carry paternal obligations. The supply of new enslaved labor would require constant replenishment through expensive, dangerous, politically complicated military conquest. Tying status to the mother solved all of these problems simultaneously. The child of an enslaved woman was enslaved regardless of paternity. The master had no legal obligations to a child he had fathered with his own property. The property itself produced new property. The operation fed itself. The Roman jurists who elaborated this principle were not troubled by what it meant for the women and children involved. They were troubled by edge cases that might create uncertainty about property rights. What if a free woman was enslaved while pregnant? The child would be free because status was determined at the moment of conception. What if an enslaved woman was free during pregnancy? The child would also be free because status was determined at birth. What if she was briefly freed and then re-enslaved before delivery? Any moment of maternal freedom during pregnancy was sufficient to transmit freedom to the child. These are the discussions preserved in the digest in the institutes, in the foundational texts that Western legal education still references. The same minds that reason with such care about maternal freedom and fetal status accepted without question the underlying premise that an enslaved woman's reproductive capacity was an economic asset belonging to her owner, and that the children she produced were property entering the market at birth. Step back and look at what this principle created at scale. At the height of the empire, slaves constituted somewhere between 30 and 40% of the population of Italy. In the city of Rome itself, perhaps 1 in 3 people walking the streets, entering the shops, filling the public spaces, was legally owned by someone else. That number did not maintain itself through conquest alone. Conquest was expensive and irregular and politically complicated. It required wars, which required armies, which required money, which required a functioning economy, which required a stable labor force. Partus ventrum was the technology that kept the numbers stable without continuous warfare. It converted enslaved women's bodies into a sustainable supply chain. It was elegant in the way that all efficient systems are elegant. It solved multiple problems with a single mechanism and required no ongoing enforcement beyond the normal operation of property law. The legal framework did not stop at establishing the principle. It developed detailed provisions to protect the owner's interest in that reproductive capacity. If a slave woman was sold while pregnant, the sale included the unborn child unless the contract specifically excluded it. If a slave woman was used as collateral for a debt, any children she bore during the debt period belonged to the creditor. If a slave woman was jointly owned by multiple masters, which happened in inheritances, her children were divided among the owners according to their ownership shares. The language used for all of these provisions was agricultural. The framework was commercial. The humanity of the women involved was not legally relevant. Modern parallel, consider what happens to any creative work produced by a salaried employee in most corporate structures. The patent, the design, the code written on a company laptop, it belongs to the company. It does not matter that you produced it with your mind and your labor, including the hours after the workday ended. The output of a resource belongs to whoever owns the resource. Rome applied this logic to the output of human bodies. The mechanism is identical. Only the thing being claimed has changed. This is the world Gaius Servilius Vatia was born into, trained in, and then systematically improved upon. He had inherited the Villa Corviana from his father, the estate sitting 12 miles outside Rome on the Via Appia 340 Eugera of agricultural land worked by 80 slaves at the time of inheritance. Within 5 years, he had increased that number to 120, not primarily through purchase, through what his own records called natural increase, his records. This is the detail that separates Vatia from his neighbors. Most Roman masters of his class and period managed their enslaved households according to habit and opportunity. They bred female slaves when it seemed profitable, sold children when buyers appeared exposed infants who seemed defective or inconvenient, and kept no systematic account of any of it. Decisions were made case by case, driven by immediate need and immediate cost. Vatia approached the same operations with the analytical attention of a man managing a financial portfolio. He identified the women on his estate with the best combination of health intelligence and physical qualities. He ensured those women became pregnant regularly, either through his own involvement or by assigning male slaves he had selected for compatible characteristics. He tracked each pregnancy from confirmation to delivery. He noted health indicators at every stage. He recorded birth weights, early developmental markers, responsiveness to stimulus. He calculated the projected value of each child at multiple points at age 5, age 10, at maturity against the cost of maintenance through each stage. He had, in modern terms, built a human asset management system, not out of exceptional cruelty, out of exceptional rationality applied to a framework that Rome's most celebrated legal minds had constructed and its most respected agricultural writers had endorsed. The Verna, the homeborn slave, commanded a premium of 30 to 40% over foreign captured stock in Roman markets at the period we are discussing. The reasons were understood by every buyer and seller who worked that market. A Verna had been raised within a Roman household from birth. They knew Roman customs, Roman expectations, Roman domestic rhythms. They had no memories of freedom to generate restlessness, no language from a distant province to mark them as foreign, No identity rooted anywhere except inside the household that owned them. They had been, to use the term a modern psychologist would apply, institutionalized from birth. They were the most compliant, the most efficient, the most predictable form of enslaved labor the Roman economy offered, and they were self-reproducing. Consider what this meant for a man like Vatia. Private equity firms today purchase hospitals with declining margins, restructure operations to maximize patient throughput, and measure human health outcomes in the same language applied to inventory turnover. Nobody in those firms considers themselves cruel. They are applying rational analysis to an asset that generates returns. The only question that guides every decision is what produces the best outcome on the ledger. Vatia was doing the same thing in the same language, with the same absence of malice, and the same complete indifference to the experience of the people inside the system. The ledger was the conscience. The ledger was the only conscience anyone consulted. Before we step into the slave quarters of the Villa Curviana and hear what an older woman named Horatia told Petronia on the evening she learned what was planned for her daughter, before we hear what 6 children reduced to 6 entries in a household ledger actually look like. From the inside, understanding what kind of man had built this operation. Vatia was not a monster by Roman standards. His slaves were adequately fed because malnourished slaves were less productive. They were housed in acceptable conditions because sick slaves required expensive treatment or replacement. They were not beaten capriciously because injured slaves could not work. By every metric Romans applied to evaluate slave management, he was a responsible owner. Neighbors studied his methods. His estate's productivity was known throughout the region. The fact that those methods included the systematic management of human reproduction, the tracking of pregnancy outcomes, the calculated decisions about which children to retain and which to dispose of, this was not a source of criticism or scandal. It was a source of admiration. Vatia was not exceptional evil. He was exceptional competence applied to a system that was itself evil. There is a difference, and the difference matters because it tells us something about how systems of institutional cruelty sustain themselves. They do not require monsters. They require capable, rational, well-respected people doing what the system defines as good work. The slave quarters of the Villa Curviana occupied the northern end of the estate, a long, low building of rough stone with small windows set high in the walls and a communal cooking area at one end. The smell in the evenings was wood smoke, dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams, the close animal warmth of many bodies sharing a confined space. The sounds were muted, not the silence of people with nothing to say, but the silence of people who had learned to say things only in ways that could not be overheard. Petronia had been in this household for 18 months when she learned she was pregnant. She had been purchased at auction after the death of her previous owner, dissolved his estate, 20 years old at the time, healthy, literate in Latin, capable of skilled domestic work, and therefore valued at a price that put her beyond most buyers. Vatia had paid that price because he recognized the specific combination of quality she carried. It was Horatia who told her what those qualities meant for the child she was carrying. Horatia was 52 years old. She had been on this estate for 30 years, had watched 3 iterations of the Vatia household pass through the generations, had survived by making herself indispensable and invisible simultaneously. She was the kind of woman that an enslaved community produces across time, someone who knows everything and has survived precisely by never appearing to know anything. She spoke to Petronia because Petronia had asked, and because Horatia remembered what it felt like to be young and pregnant and ignorant of what was coming. The master keeps the female children born to certain mothers, she said, her voice barely above the level of the fire sound. The mothers with the right features, the right intelligence, the right health. These girls are raised separately, trained in music, literacy, conversation, prepared for specific purposes. What purposes? He sells them to wealthy Roman households, not as domestic workers, as companions. You understand what I am telling you. He breeds them for that. He selects the mothers, tracks the qualities through the children. Horatia's face held the expression that accumulates in a person when they have compressed decades of grief into something functional and survivable. Yes, your daughter will have your features, your intelligence, your ability to read. She will be trained and sold. What happened to your children? The careful neutrality that slaves cultivate to survive was replaced briefly by something raw. I had 6. The first 2 were boys sold at 10 different buyers, different years, I was not told where. The third was a girl. Something wrong with her mind from birth, she did not track faces correctly. Left outside the walls on the 3rd day. The fourth was a boy kept for field labor, here on the estate. He works these grounds now. I see him sometimes from a distance. He does not know who I am. I was not permitted to tell him. He was taken at weaning and raised in the children's quarters without a mother's name attached to him. The 5th and 6th were girls, both selected for the training program, both sold to households in Rome when they turned 18. I have not heard from them since. I am not supposed to have heard from them. I am not supposed to remember they exist. 2 boys sold at 10. A girl left outside the city walls because the calculation came back negative on her 3rd day of life. A boy kept for labor, raised without knowing his own mother, was 50 yards away. 2 daughters absorbed into the training program and sold to households in the city. 6 children. 6 line items recorded by the household steward with the same neutral precision applied to livestock births and crop yield reports. Petronia absorbed this in the dim warmth of the sleeping quarters, while outside the high windows the stars moved and the estate settled into its night sounds. She did not cry. She had learned years ago what crying accomplished and what it cost. She put the information alongside everything else she had been accumulating since the examination room. She thought about the cold hands, the rectangle of gold across the stone floor, the birds singing outside the wall with their sound that had no understanding of where it landed. Vatia's posture shifting almost imperceptibly when the physician said he believed she carried a female. She thought, I will remember this. Whatever happens, I will remember every part of this. The name of the man who did it, the logic of the structure that made him. Every calculation that is about to be made about a child who does not yet have a name. She did not know yet what she would do with that memory. She did not know yet that memory carefully kept and precisely aimed would turn out to be the only weapon this enterprise had failed to account for. She only knew that she would remember, and she would use whatever she could find. Before we follow Lucia into the first year of her life, before we watch Vatia conduct a second examination of a 6-week-old infant with the same cold precision he had applied to her mother's pregnancy, consider where we are. A woman has just been told that her unborn daughter has already been assigned a purpose, a trajectory, a projected sale price at maturity. In Rome, in the year this story takes place, that was not remarkable. It was simply how property worked. The remarkable thing, the thing that this system had not built a defense against, was that the woman chose to remember. If you are still here, you are not a casual viewer. You understand that the interesting question is never what happened. It is how the conditions were built that made it normal. Our membership exists for people who want to go deeper into Roman history, into the machinery beneath the events, into the structures that repeat across centuries in different costumes. Members help choose which buried chapters get excavated next. The link is in the description. Because what is about to happen in the next section changes the frame for everything that follows. The child was born on a morning in early spring when the almond trees along the Via Appia were beginning to open and the air coming through the high window carried the first real warmth of the season. The labor had lasted 18 hours. The midwife, a Greek woman named Calliste, who had attended dozens of births on this estate, caught the infant and announced her with the flat professional voice of someone for whom the moment held no particular weight. A girl, healthy, good weight. Petronia reached for her before anyone could decide whether she should be permitted to, and Calliste, who understood certain things about letting a mother have the first seconds place the infant against her chest without comment. She was perfect. Not in the way Vatya would assess perfection when his physician arrived, not the perfection of proportions and projected quality category at maturity. Perfect in the way that undoes every calculation a person has made in preparation for a moment that makes the preparations feel beside the point, that makes the point feel like something that was never in the calculations at all. Petronia named her Lucia. The name came from the light through the window, pale gold, and early falling across the stone floor, in the same place the physician's rectangle had landed 7 months before. It was not an official name. Slaves were named by their masters. Vatya would assign whatever designation suited his organizational system. But in the private space Petronia had maintained inside herself since she was old enough to understand that a private space was necessary in that space, the child was Lucia. She had 7 weeks before the apparatus reasserted itself. They passed the way time passes when something is ending faster than the preceding months had moved with a texture of urgency that made ordinary moments feel weighted. Nursing in the blue pre-dawn hours. The specific weight of the infant as she grew. The way Lucia watched faces from the beginning with an attention that seemed like too much awareness for something so recently arrived in the world. Petronia talked to her constantly in Latin, in the scraps of Greek she had accumulated in a language that was not really a language, but the sound of someone transmitting something faster than time would allow. At 6 weeks, the household steward came with instructions. The examination room again. The same physician, the same atmosphere of assessment rendered in clinical language. This time, the subject on the table was 22 inches long and was looking at the physician's face with the specific attention she would later demonstrate to a buyer's representative, the attention that would be called a liability and would save her life. The physician checked her limbs, her reflexes, her responses to stimulus. He measured the circumference of her head, estimated her adult proportions, examined the features she had inherited from her mother. He made notations on a wax tablet. Vati observed from the doorway with his arms crossed. Excellent specimen. The physician's voice carried the satisfaction of a craftsman whose work had produced the expected result. Strong, healthy, well-proportioned. She has inherited her mother's features, which will serve her purpose as well. Assuming normal development, she should reach the highest quality category at maturity. The mother will continue nursing for 1 year. After weaning, the child will be transferred to the training facility. The mother will return to full duties and will be made available for breeding again within 3 months. He looked at Petronia directly. Do you understand? Yes, master. The words were automatic. That was what years of enslavement produced, an automaticity of correct responses that operated independently of whatever was happening in the interior space where Petronia actually lived. Yes, master came out of her mouth the way breathing came out of her body. It required no decision. Good. The child's name will be Prima. She is the first of what I intend to be a productive line. You have performed well. Continue nursing adequately, and you will be permitted occasional contact after the transfer. Prima. First, not a name the way Lucia was a name, not something drawn from light and morning and the quality of a specific moment. A position in a sequence. The first product of what Vatia had decided to call a productive line, which meant he had already planned for whatever came after, however many the system would require. Petronia carried Lucia back to the slave quarters. She held her against her chest and felt the small warmth of her, the weight, the particular smell that no other living thing would ever have. She thought, I have 1 year, 365 days, approximately 3,000 waking hours. She would use every one of them. She had no plan yet. She had information, observation, a mind that had been accumulating data about this household and this man and this operation since the moment she understood what she had been purchased to produce. She had the beginning of something that was not yet a plan, but would become one. The year moved like water, finding the lowest ground around obstacles through narrow places, always forward, always faster than expected. Lucia grew in the accelerated way that infants grow, changing week by week, into something incrementally more present and aware. She was not yet a year old when she first demonstrated the quality that would later be recorded in Vatia's ledger as a defect, and that would turn out to be the most valuable thing about her. She watched, not the unfocused scanning of ordinary infants, a tracking, cataloging attention that moved across faces and settled on expressions and seemed to be filing the information it gathered. She learned which household members brought warmth and which brought caution. She learned without anyone teaching her that silence was frequently safer than noise, that the world she had been born into was organized by forces she could not yet name, but could already map by their effects. Petronia taught her what she could in the hours they had. She whispered the Greek stories she had accumulated, Demeter searching the world for Persephone, Odysseus finding his way back through obstacles designed to prevent his return, women who survived impossible situations through patience and the willingness to appear less dangerous than they were. She taught her the word for love in 3 languages. She taught her that she was wanted. She taught her that someone in the world knew her real name. She knew these lessons were being given to a child too young to retain them consciously. She knew the building behind the cypress trees on the estate's western boundary was specifically designed to erase exactly this kind of early formation. She taught her anyway. She needed to believe that something might pass through some trace of transmission, that the conditioning could not quite reach some residue of Lucia underneath whatever Prima was made into. She was wrong about the conscious retention and right about the residue, but she would not know that for many years. The morning the guards came, Petronia was still half asleep. She had been awake at the 3rd hour nursing and had fallen back into the heavy, dreamless sleep of exhaustion. And so, when the door of the sleeping cell opened and 2 of the estate's male slaves entered with the household steward behind them, she was not prepared. She had known this morning was coming. She had known it would arrive without ceremony. She had not been able to prepare for it anyway. They collected Lucia from the crook of her arm. It happened in the space between one breath and the next, the weight present, then absent. She screamed. She had decided she would not, and then she did anyway, the sound coming from somewhere below the level of decision from the same animal place that had produced the child in the first place. She screamed until her voice gave out, until the other slaves had gathered and were holding her arms because she was trying to hurt herself, until the steward arrived with a leather strap and used it across her back until she stopped making sound. The pain was not the point. She had experienced worse during the labor. The point was that the space where Lucia had been was now filled with nothing, and nothing is heavier than absence. She did not see her daughter again for 3 years. The building behind the cypress trees occupied a separate world on the estate's western boundary, visible from neither the main house nor the slave quarters, screened by old growth that the estate's architect had planted as a windbreak, and that served the additional function of making what happened inside invisible to anyone who was not supposed to know it was there. Petronia had identified its location within her first months on the estate, had noted the pattern of staff movements, had cataloged what went in and what came out. What went in were infants. What came out years later were products. The children were housed communally separated from each other by age cohort, but not by individual identity. There was no individual identity to separate. Identity was the first thing the process removed. They were taught that the facility was their home, that it had always been their home, that the adults who managed their development were the only adults who mattered. They were not told about mothers or families or origins. When children asked, and children always asked, the questions were redirected with the practiced ease of instructors who had been answering them for years. The education they received was genuine and extensive. Literacy and calculation, Greek alongside Latin. Music, the lyre and the aulos, in the correct forms of group singing required at wealthy Roman dinner parties. Dance in the Greek style that cultured households preferred. The art of conversation, how to appear interested without expressing opinions, how to make a patron feel he was the most intelligent person in the room, how to be present without being visible, engaged without being demanding. They were also taught with the same systematic attention to accept. Not to obey obedience could be beaten into any person and produced a result that buyers could detect and priced accordingly. They were taught to accept in a way that appeared voluntary. Rewards for behavior that demonstrated appropriate internalization. Isolation for behavior that suggested inappropriate attachment to other children, to memories, to anything that connected them to an identity outside the system's frame. This is what makes the operation remarkable as a piece of institutional engineering. Its goal was not compliance. Compliance was a minimum standard that anyone could achieve through sufficient force. Its goal was the elimination of the desire to be non-compliant, the removal from the children in its care of the psychological category of alternative. It was attempting with considerable success over generations of practice to produce human beings who had ceased to experience their condition as a condition and had begun to experience it simply as what existing felt like. Modern psychology has documented a similar process in long-term solitary confinement. After extended periods of isolation, inmates do not stop wanting social contact because they choose to. They stop because the neural architecture of wanting has been eroded by sustained deprivation. The building behind the cypress trees was attempting the same result through a different mechanism, not deprivation of contact, but replacement of contact, systematic redirection of attachment from biological origin toward assigned function. The goal in both cases was a human being who had lost the capacity to imagine an alternative to their condition. By the time a child completed the program, she was a different person than the infant who had entered. She knew nothing of her origins. She had no conscious connection to the mother who had carried her. She understood herself as a product designed to serve the purposes for which she had been prepared. This was what was happening to Lucia in that building while Petronia returned to full household duties within 3 months of the separation as specified, was assigned to kitchen supervision and household inventory management, which gave her legitimate reason to move through most areas of the estate and began building the most important project of her life. She started with information. She identified every slave who had reason to enter the building, the women who brought food, the men who maintained the structure, the older slaves assigned as junior instructors in the early years of the children's education. She identified what each of them needed. She began providing it not all at once, not in ways that would draw attention, but in the methodical way of someone who understands that systems built over years are only countered by other systems built over years. By the end of the first year after separation, she had 2 contacts inside who would tell her things. By the end of the second year, she had 4. By the third year, she had assembled a picture of Lucia's development accurate enough that she could describe her progress with the specific detail of a person receiving regular reports. Lucia was ahead of her cohort in literacy. She had shown a particular facility with the lyre that was being cultivated as a premium, marketable quality. She was beautiful in the way that the physician had predicted from the 6-week assessment, her mother's features maturing in the specific directions Vatia had calculated when he selected Petronia as part of his program. She was by every metric the operation used to evaluate its outcomes an exceptional result. She was also difficult. She asked questions, not about her origins. She did not know she had origins to ask about, but about structure, about reason, about why. Why was this skill being taught and not that one? Why was contact with children in other cohorts restricted? Why did the instructors answer some questions and redirect others? The questions were not rebellious. They were curious in the specific way of a mind processing its environment with more analytical attention than the environment was designed to accommodate. The instructors noted this in their reports to the household steward: independent cognition, attachment formation with non-assigned peers, resistance to redirection. They applied standard interventions, isolation periods, restructured reward schedules, increased repetition of the core compliance training. They reported gradual improvement and continued concern. Vatia reviewed these reports with the attention he brought to his agricultural yield data. A product showing signs of defect at an early stage could still be corrected. He authorized continued intensive intervention and moved the timeline for first evaluation forward by 6 months. He did not know that Petronia had read his reasoning through the reports her contacts brought, her had understood his timeline and had begun constructing the countermove. He did not know what he was about to find out about the most carefully designed investment his operation had ever produced. Before we follow Petronia through the 3 days she had to work with, before the buyer's representative arrived, before we watch what a 7-year-old child does, with a message from a mother she does not remember, consider the structure of what has been built so far. Vatia has constructed a legally endorsed, economically optimized, institutionally sophisticated apparatus for converting human beings into marketable products. It has been running successfully for years. Every component is functioning as designed, and somewhere inside it, a child is asking questions that the design was not built to answer. The buyer's representative arrived on a morning in early autumn, traveling from Rome, in a closed carriage that announced by its quality the household he represented. His name was Lucius Petronius Flaccus. No relation to Petronia, the name common enough in that period, and he worked as a procurator for one of Rome's wealthiest senatorial families, managing household acquisitions with the same professionalism that Vatia brought to his breeding operation. He knew what he was looking for. He had evaluated trained slaves at other establishments and knew how to read the difference between conditioning that had taken and conditioning that was a performance. He spent the morning assessing the older cohort girls between 10 and 14 approaching the marketable range. He was thorough. He tested literacy with text he had brought himself, requested musical performance, and evaluated it against the standards of the households he managed, assessed conversational skills through extended interview. He identified 2 candidates worth a second look. Then they brought him Prima. She was 7, too young for purchase, but old enough for advance evaluation for a buyer willing to commit to a future acquisition at a negotiated price, reserving right of first refusal at maturity. Vatia had structured such arrangements before. He anticipated that Prima's profile would make her attractive to exactly this kind of forward contract. The educational assessment went as the records had predicted. Her literacy exceeded her age cohort by what the examiner estimated as 3 to 4 years. Her calculation was accurate and fast. Her cultural knowledge, the Greek literature, the Roman historical references, the appropriate forms of address for different social contexts was complete and smoothly accessed. Her musical performance on the lyre was the best Flaccus had heard from a child of her age in years of conducting these evaluations. She was by every metric he applied in the first 2 hours, the finest outcome he had encountered in this market segment. Then came the personal interview. He sat across a low table from Prima and asked her the standard questions, and she answered them correctly, and he was preparing to make a preliminary offer when she looked directly at his face, not at the table, not at the space beside him that trained slaves were taught to address when speaking to a freeborn man. At his face, at his eyes specifically, with the tracking attention that had been following him since she entered the room, that had been cataloging his expressions in the gap between what he said and what his face indicated he was thinking. "What will happen to me," she said, "if you buy me?" The question was not impertinent in its surface form, but it was not innocent curiosity either. It was the question of someone who understood that a transaction was being conducted in which she was the object, who wanted to understand the terms from the perspective of the object, who was capable of positioning herself as the object and also as the person asking about the object simultaneously. Flaccus answered neutrally, describing household duties in general terms. She listened. Then she asked a follow-up question, then another. Each question a precise increment beyond the previous one, mapping the shape of what he was not saying as clearly as what he was. He noted in his written report delivered to Vatia the following afternoon that the child demonstrated signs of independent cognition, operating above what was appropriate for household service. That her intelligence, while exceptional, appeared to be applying itself to analysis of her situation rather than to service of an owner's needs, that this quality might prove difficult to manage, that he recommended against purchase and suggested additional conditioning before attempting to place her in the premium market. Vatia read this report with the controlled expression he brought to information that displeased him, a product that had failed a sales assessment. The failure was not in the measured qualities those exceeded expectations. The failure was in the unmeasured quality, the one the conditioning process was specifically designed to eliminate, the one the most intensive program the facility offered had apparently not yet reached. He ordered intensified conditioning. He updated his ledger. He moved Prima's projected sale date forward by 2 years to allow time for additional work. He did not know that the question Flaccus found so disturbing had been asked because 3 days before the inspection, Petronia had bribed a supply slave with a month's worth of accumulated small favors to carry a folded piece of cloth to a 7-year-old girl in the second cohort dormitory. The cloth contained no writing, nothing that could be used against her if intercepted. Instead, she had pressed into it with a bone stylus she had borrowed and returned a series of marks that only someone who had been told what they meant could read. And she had arranged for the carrier to speak 4 words when delivering it. Your mother remembers you. She did not know if Lucia would receive the message. She did not know if a 7-year-old who had been inside that system for 6 years would have any framework for interpreting the information that a mother existed, that the mother was watching. She did not know if the child who had been named Prima from the age of 6 weeks and had never been called anything else would feel anything at all upon being told that someone on this estate knew a different name for her. She sent the message anyway. She had 3 days and she used the one tool she had. The sale failed. Prima stayed. The conditioning intensified and Lucia in the private accounting Petronia maintained, walked the line between compliance and resistance for the next 11 years with a precision that suggests she understood at some level she could not have articulated exactly what she was doing. She was not obviously defiant. Defiance had consequences she could observe in the records of other children in her cohort. She was subtly, consistently, precisely enough wrong to make every buyer who evaluated her hesitate. A question at the wrong moment. A glance held a half-second too long. A stillness in response to a directive that was compliance in form and something else entirely in quality. Each buyer's report used different language, independent, strong-willed, unlikely to adapt potential liability, and reach the same conclusion. The sales failed year after year. Lucia remained inside the apparatus that had been built to transform her into a product surviving it by becoming a product that could not quite be sold. By the time Lucia turned 18, Gaius Curvilius Vatia had a problem his system had not been designed to solve. He was sitting in his study on a morning in late summer, the shutters half closed against the heat, his ledger open to the page that had been accumulating entries under the heading Prima for 11 years. He was a man who had built his reputation on his ability to read a set of numbers and derive from them a clear decision. The numbers in front of him were clear. They simply did not yield a decision he could execute. The investment figure was substantial. 11 years of facility costs, food, housing, instruction, specialist instructors brought in specifically to address the conditioning problems. Against this revenue of zero, no sale, no return, a product evaluated by 14 separate buyers over 8 years and passed over by all 14 despite measurable qualities that exceeded the facility's historical averages in every assessed category. The problem was not the product's capabilities. The problem was that those capabilities were being applied to purposes the product had not been designed to serve. Every buyer who sat across a table from Prima and found himself being quietly, precisely evaluated by the person he had come to evaluate reached the same conclusion. This was not a risk worth the premium price. Vatia understood the situation with the cold clarity he brought to any operational problem. He was holding an asset that could neither be deployed as intended nor disposed of without cost. Exposure, the standard method for eliminating unwanted property, was a practice for infants legally and socially unremarkable only in that context. Lucia was 18 years old, physically healthy, demonstrably intelligent, and known to buyers across the Roman market in her category. Execution required legal justification. A slave could be executed for specific documented offenses, and Prima had committed none. Her resistance had never taken a form that crossed the threshold of actionable defiance. She had always remained on the correct side of the line, which was itself evidence of the intelligence he could not sell. Sale at reduced price would communicate to the market that his operation produced effective outcomes. It would undermine the premium he commanded for every other product the facility had sold over 20 years. The reputational cost exceeded the loss he was already absorbing. He was trapped inside his own logic. Think of a technology company holding a legacy software system too expensive to maintain, too dangerous to shut down abruptly, too outdated to attract buyers at full value. Every option cost more than the last decision cost. Vatia had built Prima as his flagship asset, and she had become his most expensive liability. And the logic of his own system offered him no exit that did not damage something he valued more than the loss. In the northern wing of the villa, in the linen storage room where she had spent the past 6 years as head of household inventory, a position that gave her access to every part of the estate and legitimate reason to be found in any corridor at any hour, Petronia, now 40 years old, was reading the same numbers from the outside. She had maintained her information network for all those years. It had grown from 2 contacts in the building behind the cypress trees to a web of relationships spanning the entire estate and reaching into 3 neighboring properties whose slaves had developed trading relationships with Vatia's household staff. She knew his ledger almost as well as he did. She knew his decision timeline. She knew that he had reached the end of the options his operation offered him. She knew that a man with no good choices will accept a solution he would not otherwise consider. The solution required a specific kind of person, not a buyer in the conventional market. Those buyers had already demonstrated they would not take the risk. Not an institutional purchaser, because those relationships required exactly the kind of premium product documentation that Prima's failed assessments had compromised. It required someone for whom the purchase was not primarily an economic transaction. Vatia's legitimate daughter, Servilia, had been visiting the estate 3 or 4 times per year for the past decade. She had married into the household of a senior senatorial family and occupied a position in Roman aristocratic society that depended heavily on the perceived quality of her domestic establishment. Petronia had been assigned as one of her personal attendants during these visits by a household steward who recognized that Servilia preferred slaves who could converse intelligently and anticipate needs without being asked. Petronia had spent 10 years in those attendant hours studying Servilia with the same attention she had applied to every other element of this operation. Servilia was not cruel. She was not exceptionally intelligent. She was not particularly perceptive about the inner lives of the people who served her, which was standard for her class and period, and not something she had chosen. What she was, with a consistency that Petronia had mapped across a decade of observation, was competitive. She competed for social standing with the women in her husband's family. She competed with the wives of her husband's colleagues and rivals. She competed with the women she had grown up alongside in Rome's aristocratic circles, tracking position and precedence with the meticulous attention that Vatia brought to his ledger. Every element of her household was a variable in this competition: the quality of her furniture, the sophistication of her dinner parties, the accomplishments of her domestic slaves who performed for guests and reflected on their owner's taste and resources. She had noticed across years of visits that her father's household contained slaves of unusual quality. She had not done anything about it because the path from noticing to acquiring had not yet been made obvious to her. Petronia began making it obvious 17 months before the morning she intended to act. The first planting, she was arranging Servilia's hair before a dinner party. Her hands moved through the elaborate structure of pins and heated tongs with the practiced efficiency that made her useful. She said without looking up from the work, as if the thought had arrived unbidden, the young women from the training program, I have heard guests speaking of them. Their musical accomplishments are apparently remarkable. A household that possessed such a woman would be distinguished among all others. She felt Servilia's attention shift without the woman's posture changing. Filed the response, said nothing more. The second planning came 8 months later. Servilia was reviewing her father's household accounts and had requested Petronia's assistance with the organizational work. They were sitting across a low table with documents between them when Petronia said with the same quality of apparent inadvertence, "I understand the master has one from the program who is exceptional. She has been offered to multiple buyers. None have been considered worthy of her quality." The framing was precise, not that the slave had failed to sell, but that the buyers had failed to qualify. Servilia absorbed it with the specific alertness of someone who has just identified a new variable in a competition she is always playing. 3 months after that, Petronia placed the final piece. In a corridor in passing, in the presence of one of Servilia's visiting friends from Rome, whose household was known to be competing with Servilia's in exactly the register where Servilia cared most. "I believe the young woman from the facility may finally be placed. There has been an inquiry from a household in the Calian district." There had been no such inquiry, but Servilia did not know that. What Servilia knew was that something she had not yet decided she wanted was in danger of being obtained by someone she was competing against. She approached Vatia within a month. He had been expecting, in the way of fathers who know their daughters, a request for some small domestic luxury. What Servilia asked for was prima. His calculations shifted in the space of a breath. Selling to his daughter would not communicate market failure. It would communicate a family preference, a private arrangement, a father choosing to give a valued family member access to something he might otherwise have placed externally. The reputational frame was entirely different. He would receive a price negotiated within family, but a price rather than absorbing the full loss. He would resolve the operational problem the ledger had been presenting without the costs any of his other options carried. He agreed. The negotiation resolved to a number below Prima's intended premium price, but well above the reduced market figure that would have damaged his standing. He could record it in a way that reflected reasonably on the program's outcomes. Petronia had been present for none of the negotiation. She had not needed to be. She had constructed the conditions and then withdrawn from the construction, allowing the principals to reach conclusions they believed were their own. This was the final skill the apparatus had taught her without intending to, that the most effective influence is the kind that never announces itself, that makes the influenced party feel not influenced at all, but simply decisive. She had one remaining move. In the days between the agreement and the transfer, she sought a private moment with Servilia, not an arranged meeting, nothing that could be interpreted as a request, simply the proximity that her role as personal attendant naturally created. She was helping Servilia select fabrics for new household furnishings when she said the transition may be complex. Prima has been in the facility her entire life. She will need someone who understands how she was formed, who can help her adapt to a different kind of household. A slave from the same source who has already demonstrated successful integration might ease the adjustment considerably. Servilia had found Petronia useful for 10 years. The suggestion was sensible. She included Petronia in the transfer. The city of Rome smelled different from the estate. It was the first thing Petronia noticed when the cart crossed the city boundary and began moving through streets that pressed close on either side. Wood smoke from 10,000 cooking fires. The mineral smell of stone heated by a summer of sun. Rotting vegetables from the market stalls. Animal dung and fresh bread, and the sharp chemical smell of the fuller's establishments along the lower streets. The noise was constant in layered voices, wheels hammering from construction that never stopped, the calls of vendors working their fixed positions, the sound of a city operating at full capacity all at once. After years on an agricultural estate where the loudest regular sound was the wind through the cypress trees, the city felt like being submerged. Lucia sat across from her in the cart looking at the streets with the evaluative attention that had defined her since infancy. She was 18 years old. She was composed in the specific way the program produced a stillness that appeared calm and was in fact the practiced exterior of someone who had learned that showing reaction was a form of vulnerability. She had been told she was being transferred to the household of her owner's daughter in Rome. She had accepted this information with the neutral acknowledgement of someone filing it rather than feeling it. She did not know the woman sitting across from her was the reason she was on this cart. She did not know the woman sitting across from her was the reason she was alive in the city and not sold to a household in the Kalian district or wherever the next buyer might have taken her. She did not know the woman sitting across from her had been tracking her development since she was 6 weeks old and had been working toward this specific arrangement for years that could not be counted without making the patience seem impossible. She looked at Petronia once during the journey briefly with the cataloging attention that assessed and filed. She looked away, a stranger, one of several slaves in the new household. Nothing to note. Petronia looked at her daughter and felt something she had no word for. Not joy, which was too simple, not grief, which was also too simple, but the specific compound feeling yet of a person who has spent years pursuing an outcome and has now arrived at the outcome and found that the outcome is only the beginning of the actual problem. Lucia did not know her. The conditioning, though incomplete enough to have prevented sale, had been complete enough to erase the conscious memory of anything before the facility. The child who had learned the word for love in 3 languages, who had been held in the pre-dawn hours while a woman whispered Greek myths into her ear, who had been told she was wanted and precious and known by her real name, that child existed nowhere accessible. What sat across from her in the cart was a young woman who was a stranger. The reunion Petronia had spent all those years engineering was going to have to be built from the beginning. She began in the first week with small things. She identified which tasks in Servilia's household were hardest for Lucia to navigate. Not skills which were exceptional, but context, the specific domestic politics of a wealthy Roman household that operated differently from a training facility in ways no curriculum had prepared for. She offered guidance when the opportunity arose. Accurate guidance, useful guidance, the kind that produced results and created the small debts of obligation that accumulate over time into something that can eventually be called trust. She did not rush. She had learned what patience cost when it was the only tool available, and she had learned to use it without wasting it. By the 3rd month, they were working alongside each other with the easy coordination of people who had developed a functional shorthand. By the 5th month, Lucia was seeking her out when navigating complex household decisions. By the 7th month, there was something between them that occupied the same space in their daily experience that friendship occupies, a reliability, a mutual knowledge of preferences and habits, and the specific ways each of them thought through problems built across months of proximity without either of them naming what it was. It was in the 8th month that Petronia told her the myth. They were alone in the linen storage room, working through an inventory before the autumn household accounting. The lamps were lit against the early dark. The smell was dried lavender packed into the linen cedar from the storage chests, the dust of years accumulated in the corners that no amount of cleaning quite reached. "Do you know the story of Demeter and Persephone?" Petronia said. Lucia's hands continued their work. "I learned it in the program, part of the Greek literature curriculum. What did you think of it?" A brief cessation of the folding that was not quite a stop. "I thought the separation was the truest part. The rest, the searching, the negotiation, the partial return, those feel like the story a person tells to make the separation bearable. The separation itself is what actually happened, but the reunion also happens. In the myth." Lucia's voice was neutral. "In reality, people who are separated and find each other again only in stories told by people who were not separated. Petronia set down the cloth she was holding. What if I told you there is a story that is not a myth? A version of that separation and that searching that happened on this estate in the place you came from, involving a woman who has been in this household for 10 years and a young woman who has been in this household for 8 months, and neither of them knew they were inside that story until right now. The folding stopped. Lucia turned. The cataloging attention that had been assessing Petronia since the cart from the estate was now fully present. Nothing held back applied to her face with the same intensity it had applied to the buyer's representative 11 years ago when a 7-year-old girl had asked a question she had no reason to know she should ask. "Tell me," Lucia said. Petronia told her everything. The cold hands, the rectangle of gold on the stone floor, Fatia's posture shifting when he heard the word female, Horatia's 6 children reduced to 6 entries in a household ledger, 1 year of nursing in pre-dawn hours and whispered Greek stories, and the word for love in 3 languages. The morning the guards came, 3 years of building contacts inside the building behind the cypress trees, a piece of cloth with bone stylus marks and 4 words delivered by a borrowed messenger. 14 failed assessments across 8 years, 17 months of seeds planted in a competitive woman's desire to possess something her rivals had not been considered worthy of, a negotiation she had never attended, transfer documents she had constructed from the outside. She told her daughter who she was. The silence that followed lasted longer than Petronia had expected. Lucia's face moved through a sequence of expressions that the conditioning had taught her to suppress, and that were appearing anyway, surfacing through the controlled exterior, like water finding its way through stone, not breaking the surface but visible beneath it. "You are my mother," Lucia said finally. It was not a question. "I am. You built all of this. The network, the contacts, the years of watching Servilia. You built all of this to find me. I built it because there was nothing else available to build. I was property. You were property. The only power I had was time and the ability to understand the structure well enough to use it. So I used it. We are still property," Lucia said. "We are still subject to whatever Servilia decides, whatever the next owner decides. Yes, then this is not a rescue. No, it is not a rescue." Petronia reached out and touched her daughter's face. The first deliberate touch since the morning the guards came, since the weight that had been present became absent. "It is a finding. We are found. That is different from being free, but it is not nothing. It is more than nothing by a distance I cannot calculate." Lucia did not move away from the touch. After a moment, she reached up and covered her mother's hand with her own, and they stayed like that in the lamp-lit room with the smell of lavender and cedar around them. 2 women who were legally property and actually something the law had no category for, while outside the city moved through its night business and the household settled into sleep. "Tell me what comes next," Lucia said. What came next was smaller and larger than any of the reversals the story seemed to be building toward. Not escape, not freedom, not any dramatic transformation of the conditions that still held them. What came next was the construction of a life within constraints that had not changed, and the systematic use of that life to change what could be changed within them. They worked. They were already known in Servilia's household as the most capable slaves in the domestic staff. Together, combining what Petronia had spent years learning about how information and influence moved through a Roman household with what Lucia's exceptional education had given her in terms of formal knowledge and social navigation, they became indispensable in ways that gave them access to information and movement beyond what their formal status allowed. They also found others. Servilia's household included 11 female slaves. 3 of them had histories that Petronia and Lucia understood from the inside. A woman named Flavia, separated from a daughter, sold to a household in the Aventine district. A woman named Crestilla, bred on a Campanian estate, who had not seen any of her 4 children since the youngest was weaned. A woman named Drusilla, who knew where two of her children were and had been trying for years to find a way to communicate with them. They could not undo the separations. They could not change the legal framework that made everything Vatia and men like him did not merely permissible, but rational and celebrated. They were not in a position to change the structure, but they were in a position carefully and using the techniques Petronia had developed across years of necessity to influence specific outcomes within it. They helped Flavia identify which household on the Aventine had purchased her daughter and arrange for a message to be carried there by a slave with legitimate cross-household contact. They helped Christilla learn that two of her four children were still on the Campanian estate and alive. They helped Drusilla construct a communication path to one of hers that operated entirely within normal household business and could not be identified as anything except routine domestic coordination. They could not save everyone. They saved some. They maintained connections that the apparatus was designed to destroy. They remembered and they helped others remember. And in a world where enslaved people's inner lives were legally non-existent, the act of remembering was itself a form of resistance the system had not designed against, because the system did not believe the thing being remembered was real. Petronia died in the 43rd year of her enslavement at the age of 62 in the room she shared with Lucia in the Roman house that had been their home for 22 years with her daughter's hand in hers. She had never been freed. She was listed in the household inventory at the time of her death as a domestic slave of advanced age, low remaining labor value to be replaced when convenient. She is not mentioned anywhere else in any surviving document from the Roman period. Before we sit with Lucia in the small room near the Tiber, where she finally wrote what she had carried for decades, before we watch what a freed woman does with the first hours that belong entirely to herself, hit subscribe and tap the like button so the algorithm keeps pushing real history forward. Share this video with someone who still thinks Roman civilization and its crimes can be cleanly separated from each other. Tell me in the comments which figure or system from the ancient world you want us to examine next. Lucia lived for another 30 years after her mother's death. She continued working in Servilia's household through Servilia's death and into the household of Servilia's son and then Servilia's grandson, accumulating across decades the specific kind of trust that Roman aristocratic families developed for enslaved people who had been present long enough to become institutional memory, trusted with information relied upon for continuity, valued in the way that furniture of exceptional quality is valued. When Servilia's grandson died at a point when Lucia was 70 years old and had been in this household for 52 years, he freed her in his will. The language of the document was standard loyal service, valuable contribution, manumission as appropriate reward. She was given the legal status of a freed woman of the Servilian family, which entitled her to certain civic protections and practically meant that she could move through Rome without documentation of ownership. She was 70 years old. Her body carried 52 years of domestic labor. Her life was mostly behind her. What remained was less than what had already passed. She used it to write. She sat in a small room near the Tiber that she rented with money accumulated over years of the small transactions that trusted household slaves were sometimes permitted to conduct on their own account. Morning light came through a single window and fell across a low table. She wrote about her mother. She wrote about the examination room and the cold hands and Vatia's posture shifting when the physician said female. She wrote about a year of nursing and Greek stories whispered in the dark and a word for love in 3 languages. She wrote about a morning when guards came before dawn and a weight that had been present became an absence. She wrote about the building behind the cypress trees, its architecture of forgetting, its careful dismantling of the self and reconstruction of the self as function. She wrote about a message carried by a borrowed slave to a 7-year-old girl who did not know what a mother was and understood anyway. She wrote about 14 failed assessments, a piece of cloth pressed with bone stylus marks, 17 months of seeds planted in a competitive woman's desire to possess something her rivals had not been considered worthy of. She wrote about a lamplit room and the smell of lavender and cedar, and the specific quality of recognition in her own hands, covering her mother's hands for the first time in a space they could both inhabit as themselves. She wrote about what Roman law permitted. She wrote about what Roman law called rational. She wrote about the principle that turned motherhood into a mechanism of perpetual supply, that classified children as assets and mothers as production units, that allowed the most celebrated jurists in Western history to write with careful precision about the edge cases of a system they never questioned, because the system was producing exactly what it was designed to produce. Her account did not survive in its original form. A document written by a freed woman of no significant family in the late Roman period was not considered worth copying. It existed in a single copy that was lost along with most of the material from that household in the disruptions of the following century. But fragments survive passages incorporated into later texts by writers who had access to the document before it was lost, who cited it as a source for specific claims about the operational practices of Roman slave breeding programs, who preserved enough of its substance that scholars centuries later would trace their sources back to what they came to call the testimony of Prima. Those fragments are part of what makes it possible to tell this story with the specificity it deserves. Now consider what Gaius Corvilius Vatia actually produced. He built a breeding program to generate assets. He maintained careful records, tracked each pregnancy, calculated returns at multiple points across each child's projected development. He selected Petronia specifically for the combination of qualities he believed would produce the most valuable offspring. He impregnated her, classified the result as Prima, designed an 18-year conditioning program to transform that result into a premium product, and watch the product fail to sell because it had retained a capacity for independent thought that he could not eliminate. In the end, his most carefully designed investment outlived him. By decades was freed by the great-grandson of the daughter he had sold her to, and used her freedom to write his name into the historical record. Not as a success, not as a model of rational property management, as evidence, as documentation of what the apparatus did and how it worked and what it cost the people it processed. Vatia wanted a daughter. He got one. She just wasn't his. The testimony of Prima is what remains of Gaius Corvilius Vatia, not his ledgers, which no one preserved, not his breeding records, which scholars found too distasteful to examine closely, not his estate, which passed through several hands and eventually became agricultural land indistinguishable from any other. What remains is the account written by the woman he classified as Prima, first of a productive line asset entered on a ledger at the age of 6 weeks and never once correctly appraised. He built the operation to turn people into property. The only thing that survived it was a person.